May 8th, 1794. For nearly a year now, France has been living through what history would come to call the Reign of Terror, a stretch of the revolution in which a committee-run government sent thousands of perceived enemies to the guillotine, often on little more than suspicion. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were already dead. And the revolution has turned its hunger on the machinery of the old regime. The financiers, the privileged, the men who collected the crown's taxes off the backs of everyone else. On this early May day, 28 such men were made an example. They were members of the Fermier Général, the syndicate of private financiers who collected the king's taxes at a profit off ordinary French citizens. In a country starving and newly free, there was no more hated a profession. The 28 of them were tried and executed all in the span of a single day. One of them was Antoine Lavoisier. If you don't know his name, you certainly know his legacy, known as he is today as the founder of modern chemistry. But genius couldn't outweigh the wealth, couldn't override the deep hunger to be rid of anything that so much as smelled of the old France. As the story goes, his commitment to his craft was so strong that he didn't fight the sentence, but he did ask for a delay, just long enough to finish the experiment he was working on at the time, a question of oxygen's role in respiration, something that wouldn't be fully understood until the 20th century. The request, if it was really made, was refused. And so on that spring afternoon, Lavoisier waited his turn in a line of 28, the same scaffold, the same blade, the same indifferent crowd, and one of the great minds of the age was gone in the time it takes to read you this sentence. And helping run the machinery that brought Lavoisier's neck to the blade was the man who had painted him and his wife 6 years earlier, Jacques-Louis David. 6 years. That's all the distance there is between the tender, devoted portrait now hanging in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the severed head in a basket. One of the most important paintings of the 18th century, inventive and tender, made in a world that had no idea what was coming. And it helped shape how its subjects were seen all the same. This is a story about art as propaganda, about how a portrait can argue for who someone wants to be and stay silent about what they've done. About passion and reason, and a painter who spent his life praising the second while ruled in his worst moments by the first. And about the strange, unanswerable gap between the man who made that painting and the man who helped feed its subject to the terror. I'm Emma Laramie, and this is Verso. Before the dawn of the Revolution, Jacques-Louis David was already one of the most notable artists in France, as much for his personality as for his work. A naturally passionate and excitable man, he was known to be mercurial, volatile, ardently enthusiastic, and fiercely independent. A good example is when, as a young artist, denied the Prix de Rome, he became so despondent he tried to starve himself to death until a friend talked him out of it. In 1775, he finally made the life-changing trip to Italy, which would have an enormous effect on both his art and his ideals. When he returned to France in 1780, David quickly became the star of what we now call the neoclassical movement. As the name suggests, the movement wanted to revive the ideals, themes, and aesthetics of ancient Greece and Rome, filtered through the Age of Enlightenment that prized logic and science and order. His early works, paintings like The Oath of the Horatii and The Death of Socrates, carried those threads. They were ancient stories and classical compositions, but in late 18th century France, they spoke to something else as well. Self-sacrifice on behalf of one's country, on behalf of the greater good. In The Oath of the Horatii, a father sends his 3 sons off to fight for Rome, all of them willing to die for the fate of their country. And within David was a kind of tension that made him, on the one hand, ripe to become one of the leaders of the French Revolution, and on the other, asks us to question his participation in it. Some have seen his love of all things classical as extending past art and into his life. He wanted a republican government like ancient Rome's. Others thought his impassioned personality made him a natural fit for revolutionary ideals. But whatever the reason, and it was probably a bit of both, there was a part of him that understood reason, a part of him that understood passion, and a part of him that wanted everything old to be discarded. By the end of the 1780s, David was one of the most prominent artists in France, and though he was best known for his history paintings, he was not opposed to taking on a portrait commission. Enter Antoine Lavoisier and his wife Marie-Anne. Antoine was the kind of man who never doubted his own worth or intellect. Wealthy, high-minded, and enormously ambitious, he was rationality and purposefulness personified. These were not traits he bore without merit, but they did not make him a universally beloved figure. Lavoisier today is best known as the father of modern chemistry, responsible for so much that would mean something to you even if you knew next to nothing about the subject. He named oxygen and hydrogen. He established that water was a compound, not an element, and that sulfur was an element, not a compound. He assembled the first extensive list of elements, and he discovered that even when something changes its shape, its mass stays the same. He was, in short, an incredibly important mind. And while chemistry may have been his great love, Lavoisier was deeply involved in civic life, for better and for worse. He was a member of the Fermier Général, a syndicate of tax collectors that would front the crown its estimated tax revenue for the year and then collect that money back from the French citizens for a profit. He went so far in these duties that he commissioned a wall built around the city of Paris so that customs duties could be collected on goods moving both in and out of the city. The Fermier Général also had an interesting relationship with the tobacco trade, holding something close to a monopoly on its import. And when that revenue began to fall, they took to diluting the tobacco with a mixture of ash and water that let them distribute more of it for less. And to make sure that that all went smoothly, Lavoisier personally devised a system of checks and balances for tobacco imports and sales, one that kept the retailers actually selling the stuff from padding their own profits in the same way. So all of this work helped fund his scientific experiments, but it did not gain him one single point in the popularity department. Lavoisier's wife, Marie-Anne, was a force in her own right. The two met through her father, himself a member of the Fermier Général, and they were engaged when Antoine was 28 and Marie-Anne only 13. It reads as grotesque now, and it should, but at the time, an arrangement like this was kind of unremarkable, and her father made it specifically to spare her a match with a much older and far less appealing man. By every indication, Antoine and Marie-Anne went on to genuinely love each other. But Marie-Anne was incredibly smart and talented. She studied art under David himself and used her drawing skills to illustrate her husband's published experiments. She mastered English, something Lavoisier never managed, and translated works for him. She trained in chemistry through one of his colleagues and assisted in his experiments, observing and taking down his notes. So their partnership was, by all accounts, genuinely collaborative. The painting David made of Antoine and Marie-Anne is remarkable not only for its artistic merits, but for what it says about how these people wanted to be seen, and for crystallizing a moment in which their paths crossed in a way that would look very different just 6 years later. As it appears to us today, hanging in the Met in New York, the painting stands about 9 feet tall by 6 feet wide, far larger than other portraits of non-nobles from the period. Lavoisier sits at his desk, the instruments of his trade all around him. He wears a simple black outfit as he looks up at his wife, who also wears a relatively understated white-gray muslin gown. She leans over his shoulder while gazing directly out at us, as if she's caught us walking into the room. That's another novelty of the painting. It was unusual for a woman to be placed higher in the composition than her husband. So she really is the focus of the scene despite all of his tools surrounding them. There's not much behind them except for a few austere classical pilasters set against a gray wall. And for a long, long time, that was most of what there was to it. Until 2021, when an entire first draft of the painting was discovered underneath the one we see today. And it is wildly different. Marie-Anne's outfit was far more ostentatious, complete with a giant plumed hat trimmed in ribbons and artificial flowers. Lavoisier's outfit was showier too, a longer coat with bronze buttons and a red mantle across his shoulders. His chemistry equipment also wasn't there. But you know what was? 3 scrolls of paper unfurling over the edge of the table, marking his position as a tax collector. Now, we don't know whose idea it was to go from version 1 to version 2, but either way, the couple was turned from rich tax farmers into rational moderns at the very dawn of the Revolution. If it was the Lavoisier's choice, the painting becomes an act of self-fashioning, a couple editing their own image as the political ground shifted underneath them, hoping to make their work look more vital than their fortune. If it was David's, perhaps it was a kind of sympathy shown to his former student. But a painting can only ever show us a version of someone, the one they chose or the one the artist chose for them. It can't tell us what they'll do next. And in the years right after David set down his brush, the same man who may have softened a portrait for his former student would pick up a different kind of instrument entirely. Because the revolution was coming, and David would not be standing at its edge. He would be helping to run it. David belonged to the Jacobin Club, a nationwide network of staunch anti-royalists with a heavy hand in the revolution. He ran with its more radical wing and counted among his close friends Maximilien Robespierre, who between 1793 and 1794 would become the very face of the Reign of Terror. Whatever rational, measured man may have entered this story, by 1793, David was in deep, and he stayed there, committed enough to sign arrest orders for people who had once been his friends. Where he truly shone, what he's best remembered for today, was as the revolution's image maker. Painting his friend Marat as a Christ-like martyr in the bath where he'd been murdered, designing the icons and staging the festivals that honored the dead of the cause, David's pictures made an argument, and they made it brilliantly. But perhaps his most consequential work was the kind history has been quietest about, and it had nothing to do with a canvas. During the Terror, the National Convention, which held full legislative power, governed through 3 bodies: the Committee of Public Safety, which set policy, the Committee of General Security, which was the police arm that hunted, interrogated, and decided who would stand trial, and the Revolutionary Tribunal, which judged them. The middle one is where you would find David. He sat on the Committee of General Security and ran interrogations for the section covering Paris. That put him among the 14 men who decided who got handed to the tribunal and let him preside over the questioning that fed those decisions. Years later, after the blood had dried, David would insist he'd barely been involved at all, and historians, reluctant to let the politics tarnish the painter, largely took him at his word. But the records don't. His signature sits on nearly as many decrees sending Parisians to the tribunal as Robespierre's does. And one of those signatures set off a snowball that would end at Antoine Lavoisier's head. Remember that tax-collecting syndicate Lavoisier belonged to? In 1793, its dean, Jean Douay, became the subject of a warrant, signed by David, authorizing his arrest and the search of his home. And once the search started, once the books were open, the rest followed fast. 10 days later, the convention decreed that every last member of the Fermier Général be arrested, imprisoned, and audited. Lavoisier among them. So that's the case against David, and it's a real one. A man who painted the Revolution's saints and ran its interrogations. A man who signed away friends without flinching and whose pen helped open the door that the whole Fermier Général, Lavoisier included, was dragged through. By any fair reading, David is not a bystander to the terror. He is one of its hands. And yet, here is the strange thing, the thing that keeps this from being a simple story about a villain. When the warrant came for the Fermier Général as a body, the order that sent all of them toward the tribunal, David's name is not on it. The man who signed the arrest of their dean does not appear on the document that doomed the rest of them. And it wasn't only Lavoisier. Across David's entire tenure as a political policeman, with all the power he had to settle scores, not a single artist was sent to the scaffold. Not even the ones he had every reason to hate, the men of the old Royal Academy he'd spent years fighting. It's tempting to read that as mercy, to imagine that somewhere under the Jacobin and the propagandist there was a man who drew a private line he wouldn't cross, who could not quite bring himself to sign the name of someone he'd painted or taught or simply recognized as a fellow artist. But honesty makes us slow down here because the record won't let us go quite that far. The committee's own rules meant no single member could send someone to trial or save them. Arrests took a majority of votes and releases took more. So a missing signature might be conscience, or it might be nothing more than a vote that didn't need him or a document that happened to circulate when he wasn't there. We don't get to know. We can see the gap, the space where his name should be and isn't, and we can feel how much we want to fill it with something redemptive. But the truth is we'll never really know. And maybe that's the more unsettling version anyway. A clean villain is easy. What David gives us instead is a man who would sign against a friend and spare an enemy in the same season and leave us no way to tell which impulse was the real one. The portrait can't tell us. His record can't tell us. So the gap stays open. Which brings us back to where we started, on May 8th, 1794. Now you know the machine that brought Lavoisier to that scaffold, and you know the painter standing somewhere near its controls, his name on the first link of the chain and absent from the last. 28 men of the Fermier Général, tried in one morning, gone by the afternoon. The mathematician Joseph-Louis Lagrange, who had known Lavoisier, is said to have summed it up the next day, something to the effect of, "It took only an instant to cut off that head, and 100 years might not produce another like it." History, in its way, agreed. A year and a half after the blade fell, the French state quietly exonerated Lavoisier, conceding he had been falsely convicted, and returned his confiscated belongings to his widow with a note saying as much. That widow, Marie Anne, the woman in the painting, outlived the terror and spent her remaining years trying to continue her husband's legacy. Bankrupt, her husband's notebooks and instruments seized, she managed to claw his papers back, see his final work put into print, and wrote a preface so scorching toward the men she blamed for his death that almost no publisher would touch it. She did marry again, briefly and unhappily, to a scientist named Count Rumford, and when they divorced, she took her first husband's name back and kept it for the rest of her life. The collaborator became the curator of his memory. As for David, the survivor survived. When Robespierre fell, David fell ill, a sudden stomachache that kept him home from the session where his friend was condemned, and very probably kept his own head on his shoulders. He was imprisoned, released, and then did what he had always done. He found the next regime worth painting. He became Napoleon's image maker, gave the emperor the same heroic argument he'd once given the Republic, and died decades later in exile in Brussels, having outlasted nearly everyone else in this story. This episode was written, narrated, and produced by me, Emma Laramie. If you enjoyed this story, if something here surprised you, made you think differently, or just gave you something interesting to talk about over drinks with friends, do me a favor. Follow the show. Leave a rating or a review if you're feeling generous. And if there's an artist or a moment in art history you're curious about, drop a comment below. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.